Hello and welcome back to this video series where we're looking at building an e-commerce platform in 25 days using Next, Netlify, and Stripe. So in this video, we're finally going to wire up the last little bits of the functionality that we've been building across this entire month. So currently we can add items to a cart. We can then look at that cart and say, yep, that's exactly what I want to buy. And then head to the checkout. And then when we press this process payment button, this is sending across all of the IDs and the quantities of the items that we want to purchase. And then we're putting that together on the server side with the products from our actual markdown files. But then at that point, we're not doing anything with them. So in this video, we're going to look at sending that stuff over to Stripe and actually charging the user. So let's head over to our serverless function. Actually, before we get started, it's probably a good idea for us to delete this test.js function. So this is exposing our Stripe public key. Again, this isn't the biggest deal. Like the idea of our public key is that it can be public and it can exist in our client. But it's probably just a good idea to delete this test.js function because we're not going to be using that in our final version of our application, and it's really just exposing some data that we don't need to expose. So it doesn't matter if it ends up in the final version, but I'm just going to delete it. Okay, so let's just have a look at what we're doing currently in this charge card function. So we can also get rid of this process.env Stripe public key. So we have our cart, which we're pulling out from our event.body, so whatever we've been sent across from the client. We're then going and getting those products, which again is iterating over all of those markdown files and putting together each of our products' extra data. We're then mapping over all of the items in our cart and kind of merging those two objects together. So merging the rest of the information about our product with our quantity, which is what our user has provided. So now we just need to do this part where we're talking to Stripe and charging the card. So the first thing we need to do is turn this cart with products array into an array of line items. So we're going to map over each one of those products and then return an object that's in the structure that Stripe is expecting. Okay, so a couple of things to note here. Firstly, our keys are now going to be in snake case. So this is all lowercase with underscores anywhere where there would be a space. This is a little bit different to camel case, which we've been using for all of our JavaScript stuff. So we just need to make sure that this matches exactly. So price underscore data and product underscore data. The next thing is the currency. So my currency is going to be AUD. This might not be the case for you. This could be USD or something else. So make sure that you change that to the currency that you're expecting. Otherwise, you might be charging way more or way less for the products than you're expecting to be. So the next section is a product name and then the product price that we want to charge for this. So remember, both of these aren't coming from the data that's being sent across from the client, because otherwise they could put in a silly name or put in a much lower price. And so we have validated this data on the server side to make sure that this is what is actually in our markdown files for those particular IDs. And then the quantity is the quantity that the user has said they would like to purchase. Okay, so now line items is going to be an array of all of the products that the user had in their cart, but it's been formatted in this very particular way, which is what Stripe is looking for. So the next thing we need to do is actually bring in the Stripe library. So I'm going to stop my server and install a Stripe package. So we're just going to say npm I Stripe. Then I'm going to run Netlify dev again, so my server's running. And then up at the top of this charge card file, I'm going to bring in the Stripe library. And then after we've required in that library, we're going to add another set of brackets. So we're going to immediately call that function that Stripe gives us back, and we're going to pass it process.env.stripe secret key. So remember, this secret key can only ever be accessed on our server side. So since we're inside our Netlify function, this is all good. So now back down after we have declared our line items, we now need to declare a new Stripe checkout session. And then this takes a configuration object as its parameter. So we specify that the payment method type that we're expecting is card. We pass across those line items, which we've formatted in a way that Stripe is expecting. The mode is payment. And then we have our success URL and our cancel URL. So they're going to /success and /cancelled, which we created in those previous videos. And we just need to prepend that with event.headers.host, as this tells us which environment we're running in. So this event is automatically passed in to our handler function. And then inside that, we can access the headers and access which host we actually got a request from. So if we're running over localhost, this will be localhost port 8888/success. And then if we're running in Netlify land, this will be whatever our site URL is /success. So now we have a new Stripe session, and so that's what we're going to send back as the body of our request. So we're going to send back an object with an ID key set to our session.id. And since we're returning this as the response from our function, we can't give it this kind of complex JSON data type. So we just need to wrap that in a JSON.stringify, and that should do the magic for us. Great, so now we have our serverless function, which is communicating with Stripe in order to charge that card. So now we just need to send a little bit more information across from the front end. So over in our checkout.js page, we need to bring in the Stripe JavaScript library. And so we need to install that. So we're going to install that from npm. So npm I @stripe /stripe-js. Then we're going to start our server again. And back in our checkout.js, we need to bring in that library. So we're going to import the load Stripe function from @stripe /stripe-js. And then back down in process payment, before our Axios call to actually process that payment, we want to call that load Stripe function that we just brought in. And we're going to pass that function our process.env.stripe public key. So make sure we're awaiting that response, and then we're saving that in a variable called Stripe. And then after our call to our Netlify function, we're just going to get rid of this console log, and we are going to call stripe.redirect to checkout. And then we're going to pass it a configuration object with a session ID set to our data.id. So remember from our Netlify function, so this one here, we are returning this object with an ID set to our session ID. And so that's what we're getting back as data here. And so then we're just passing that session ID on to our redirect to checkout call. So now we should be able to head back over to our application and click our process payment. And this is saying there is an unhandled runtime error, blah, 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 you should specify undefined. Okay, so it looks like our Stripe public key is not getting piped through. So in next.js, when we specify environment variables, these will all be available to the server-side logic. So all of our server-side functions will have access to anything in our .env file. But if we want to explicitly whitelist this for our browser, so if we want our browser to be able to access this, so our actual Next.js application, we need to prepend this with next public. So next_public_Stripe public key, and make sure you only do this for your public key, because again, we only want our public key to be accessible by the client. Our secret key should only be accessible by our serverless functions. So now that we've called this next public Stripe public key, we need to copy that and come back to our checkout, and that's what we're going to have here. Instead of process.env, just our Stripe public key, we need to prepend that with our next_public_ as well. So this will now work in our development environment because we have this .env and we've specified our environment variable. But when we push this up to Netlify, it isn't going to be able to match an environment variable for this next_public Stripe public key, only the Stripe public key. So we need to go and update that in Netlify as well. So again, in our site settings under build and deploy, we've then got our environment variables, and we just want to edit this variable for Stripe public key and make it next underscore public underscore stripe underscore public key, and we can keep the key the same. Okay, so we should be all wired up correctly now. The last thing I'm going to do is just quit our server and rerun Netlify dev. Anytime we change any of those environment variables, anything in .env, it's a good idea to rerun our server so that it definitely reads that file in again. Okay, so now when we head back to our application and click process payment, we are getting a 500. Okay, so if we have a look at the error that we're getting here, it's saying not a valid URL. And so it looks like this is happening in the Stripe library. And so I'm assuming this is here where we have our success URL and our cancel URL when we're trying to set up our Stripe session. And so I'm just going to replace this rather than saying event.headers.host and trying to pull that out of the headers. I am going to replace this with an environment variable that exists called URL. So process.env.url should give us that same thing. So if we're running locally, so if we're running over localhost, this will be set to localhost over port 8888. And if we're running in prod, so if we're up in Netlify land, this will be our site URL. Okay, so this time it will totally work. So we come back to our checkout page, we click process payment, and look, it redirects us to the Stripe UI. Awesome. So we can test that the actual Stripe flow works correctly. We can put in any email we want here. It's not going to go and check that that's a real email. We can then use a test card, so just 4242424242, and then this can be 0424, and then whatever we want as a CSV. And again, whatever name we want on the card, this doesn't matter, and we can click pay. And you'll see that's accepted our credit card payment, and it's redirected us to our success page, and now our cart should be empty. Awesome. And so now if we wanted to test that other pathway, so what would happen if we didn't go ahead with the sale, so we wanted to cancel our payment, we'll just need to add a couple more items to our cart, and then we go to the checkout, we click to process payment, and then you'll see we're back in the Stripe flow, and then we might go, I want to look at the details for this. Oh, actually, I don't know if I actually want those. I don't think I want those cooking classes, definitely. But now I'm not even sure about the basketball hoop. And so now if you quit out of this Stripe flow, you'll see that we get that payment cancelled page. So you could make this a little bit more personalized. You could also show the items that are in the cart and maybe give them the opportunity to remove particular items. But yeah, all of our Stripe stuff is wired up correctly. And so now we can just test that this is still working in production. And then let's head over to Netlify. So once Netlify has deployed our production version of our application, we can make sure we have some things in our cart and then click this process payment button. And now nothing's happened when I've clicked that button. And so now looking in the console, it looks like there was some kind of 500-ish error, which means something has happened on the server side. So if we want to dig into some logs for our serverless functions to find out what's going on, we can come across here to our functions and we can have a look at our charge card function. So you'll see here that the last log message was an error, that there was no such file or directory var/task/content. So the problem here is that inside our charge card serverless function, we're trying to reach into this content directory when we're trying to read the whole directory to get the file names and when we're trying to read each individual file. So if we have a look at the directory structure here, we're inside this functions folder, and then we're trying to reach out of here and into content, and then look at these different markdown files. So it turns out that works perfectly fine when we're running in development mode because those folders exist. So we can go out of this functions folder and into this content folder. But when we push this up to Netlify land, it does its magic to turn these into serverless functions, and it essentially moves those serverless functions out somewhere else. And so it's no longer in this same directory structure where it can come out of this folder and go into the content folder. So the serverless function is only going to have access to files that are actually in this functions folder. That's all Netlify is going to look at and bundle up and push off to that serverless functions magical land. So we could write our own little bit of logic that goes to this content folder, reads over all the markdown files in here, and then creates a file like a JSON file within this functions folder with all of that data in it. So then this charge card function would only need to bring in that one JSON file, and then that would essentially replace this get products function. Okay, so out in this root directory, I'm going to create a new file called build function content. And then I'm just going to take this get products function and move it over to our build function content file. And then this uses Matter, and it also uses the file system. And now we're not using either of those in our charge card .js file anymore. They were both within that function. So I'm going to take those two require statements and move those into our build function content file. Okay, so the rest of this function should still work, and we can test that by just console logging out, calling that function, get products. So then we can run this new file by going to terminal, and we'll just type ls just to make sure that it is in that same directory that we're in, and then we can type node, and then we'll need to do / to say from this directory run this file. Cool, and we get each of our products there, and it's a nice big JSON object or a JSON array of objects. Okay, cool. So since we have all of those products now in a JSON object, we could just take that JSON object and write it to a .json file. So fs.writeFileSync is obviously the opposite of read file sync, so that's going to let us write a file to the file system. So then we just need to give it a file path that we want to write that to, and then we need to give it the data that we want to write to that file. So let's create those two variables. So let's say file path can be equal to, and then we can probably copy what's up here because we're going to want something like this. But rather than writing this to the content folder, we want to write this to that functions directory. And so that's going to allow us to actually read in those products from within our functions folder. And so the name of our file is going to be products.json. And then the data that we actually want to write to here is going to be the data that we get back from calling get products. So we could just say, well, const products are equal to calling that function. And then the data that we want to pass down can just be products. Okay, cool. So now if we run our function, we shouldn't see any output. But now if we go up to our functions folder, we have this products.json. Now this is full of object, and this is because at this point, products is equal to a big JSON data structure, whereas when we're writing to a file, we can only write out string characters. And so we just need to, again, stringify this JSON array into just one big long string that we can write to that file. So now if we run this again, it should overwrite that file. And we now have our big proper JSON object with all of that data. Awesome. So now inside our charge card function, we want to import that. So we want to say const products equals require. And now we can give it that relative path. So we can say /products.json. And because this is inside the functions folder, this is all going to get bundled up when Netlify does its magic. So now where do we actually call products? So here we created a new variable called products by calling that function. So we don't have that function anymore, but we have this variable already created. So we don't need this line at all. Awesome, so that should now all wire up correctly with Netlify's black magic that makes it all happen. So that should be all good. The last thing I wanted to do is in our package.json, we probably want to run this file automatically as part of our scripts here. So if we were going to run this build script, or if Netlify was going to run this build script for us, we definitely want to run it before it runs next build. But we probably also want to run it before this dev script here. So when we're running locally, we probably want to build that file. And when we're running in Netlify's production land, we probably want to build that file just to keep it consistent between those two environments. So if we want to run some logic before another script, we can prepend that script with the word pre. And then whatever we have here is going to run immediately before our dev script runs. So in this case, we want to say node, and then the path to our build function content file. And we probably want to do the same thing before we build. And just to prove that that is working correctly, we can come up here and delete that products.json file. So we can prove this is working locally just by running our dev script. And remember, this happens when we run Netlify dev. So here we can run Netlify dev, and that's going to do all its magic and start up our web server and everything. But if we have a look, our products.json file is back. So just by telling it to run dev or run build, it's going to go off and create that new JSON file that we need in Netlify serverless land. Okay, so that works perfectly locally. Let's go see if that does work in production. And now that that's published, we can head back to our superstore.netlify and refresh this page and click that process payment button. And it works! Awesome! So we're back in Stripe land. And we can see that the details are all there as well. We've got all our extra bits that we pulled out of that JSON file. This is probably a little bit too expensive for me to go through the test process with a real credit card. But yeah, everything here is working correctly. And if we were to click back here, we'd go to our cancelled page. Awesome. So that brings us to the end of our full end-to-end implementation of our e-commerce store. In the next video, we'll do a little bit of a wrap up. I'll see you there.